All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassie Trewick. I'm one of the admission counselors here at Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Thank you all so much for joining our Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Today, I have with me Dr. Sarah Michaels, who is a part of our lovely Tropical Medicine and Infectious Disease Department. She will be presenting her Public Health Discovery Seminar Series on living with water, mosquito-bound disease risk in New Orleans. And so I have the pleasure again to introduce Dr. Sarah Michaels.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. Yes. So today I'll be talking about some of my interests and work in this area about mosquito-borne diseases. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Disease. I teach a variety of graduate and undergraduate courses. My background, I have an undergraduate in environmental science. I'm originally from upstate New York. So I went to the University of Rochester for undergrad. And I actually moved to New Orleans to get my graduate degree. I have an MSPH in parasitology, and then I worked for a bit, but I came back and finished a PhD in tropical medicine. So I'm really lucky to be able to work in the department that I graduated from. And so in between, I have a clinical assistant professor position because I have had a lot of public health practice experience locally and in other states as well. I was an infectious disease epidemiologist at the Louisiana Department of Health. I was also a research scientist in the arthropod-borne disease section of the New York State Department of Health. And most recently an entomologist at the City of New Orleans Mosquito Control Board. And then I kind of transitioned into teaching, starting with an instructor position at Cornell. They have a Center of Excellence in Vector-Borne Disease there. And so let's see, I'm going to try to close that off so I can see a little bit better. So for today, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the history and some environmental factors in New Orleans. I'll tell you a little bit about my community partners and the living with water efforts. Then I'll talk about some mosquito biology, fun stuff, and also some data collection and how we do that in terms of mosquito abundance and looking at impacts. And then I'll talk about some specific studies that we have on blood meal sources and canine heartworm disease, which is not a human pathogen, but I'll get to that. So New Orleans, in particular, when New Orleans was developed, wealthier residents tended to cluster around major streets of the city, and that's where the elevation was the highest, and also the risk of flooding was low. And so people who are recent immigrants, working class, free people of color tend to be forced to reside in the back of town areas. And those areas were further from the river and closer to historic natural cypress swamps and lying behind a natural levee system. And in those areas, the land, the housing was cheaper, but were flood prone. And this pattern remained into the 1920s and really echoes across measures that we see now in place-based inequities. So you're probably all very familiar with the discriminatory practices that occurred throughout U.S. cities around real estate and federal investments, and which drove rapid suburban growth and investment and disinvestment away from urban areas. And so that practice of redlining, we still see impacts correlating with urban life expectancy today. New Orleans is distinctive, however, to how these processes interact with the pre-existing landscape of environmental risk and existing racial segregation, and layering on these impacts of redlining as well. So how do we take all that information? How do we take that understanding of that environmental risk, those health inequities? What tools do we have to measure and understand those impacts? There is an index called the Social Vulnerability Index, or we abbreviate to SVI. This was developed by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And they took 15 census variables. And so sometimes you'll see a lot of epidemiologic studies that will look at a single variable, that maybe look at income or housing type. And so this was a way to take all of this census information that had other descriptions and dynamics about poverty, what would put people at risk. And so this is typically, or was developed really to prepare in advance of and respond to emergency events. And those things historically, and really what uh, the time frame that this tool was developed was post-Katrina New Orleans, and so post-Hurricane Katrina. So it was thinking from the place of how do we respond to natural disasters, or maybe other environmental events like exposure to dangerous chemicals. But now we see SVI being really applied to disease outbreaks. In fact, during coronavirus, the New Orleans Health Department utilized these tools to understand where to put testing sites and vaccine sites so that that the larger and diverse number of people could access those sites through a variety of means, public transportation and by car and by foot. And so it has been applied recently here. And in looking forward, we're looking at response, recovery, and mitigation of the impacts of these kind of events. So what's in the Social Vulnerability Index? So I talked a lot about housing structure and racial disparities, and sort of giving you some context about New Orleans in specific, and why these things are often linked and persist. But in the Social Vulnerability Index, we have an overall vulnerability estimate, but we have these subgroupings as well. So we have the social economic status, people living below poverty, unemployment income, educational status. Then we have household composition and disability. Older people, younger people, people that are young with disabilities, that there's a single parent household. So looking at basically what would make that household vulnerable to the impacts of one of these events. We also look at language, we look at housing type, crowdedness, lack of vehicle access. So all of these come together to give an idea of whether community is vulnerable, or of low vulnerability, or of high vulnerability. So 2 maps of New Orleans. If you're not familiar with New Orleans, and I've already showed a lot of maps, but this is the Mississippi River. This is the bend in the river. New Orleans extends to the west bank of the river as well. And it extends to the lake, Lake Pontchartrain, and in the top. So you can see that some of these historic red-lined areas of the city in red are also where we see this place-based inequity today. We look at social vulnerability, so vulnerable populations within the city. And so this is where we get to what are the factors? In this case, I'm going to be talking about some of the environmental factors that puts these people living in these areas at disproportionate risk. Well, if I talked to you last year, I would say New Orleans is pretty dry, but most of the time, New Orleans is we have a large amount of rainfall. If you look at the map on the top of the United States, you can see Louisiana is in the darkest blue. So it is often the rainiest or second rainiest state, takes turns with Hawaii. We have on average about 60 inches of rain per year. And of the state, New Orleans is the rainiest city, and likely the rainiest state in the country. You would know today it's very beautiful here, but most years we exceed that average rainfall. And in 2020, we had over 70 inches, 2021, 86 inches, and we actually exceeded our end year point by mid-August. So it fell very early in the year. We were close to average in 2022, and last year we were actually in a pretty extreme drought, which caused a lot of other trouble that we won't quite get to today. Here's the thing, not just the volume of rain, but the way precipitation happens. So we've had an increasing amount, and this is increasingly common across the southern US, of more severe weather events. So extreme precipitation. And so we've had single day events that exceeded more than 2 inches and exceeds the rate per hour. So in New Orleans, what we need, so you can see here's a map of the city looking, and so you can see the developed areas in the gray color and the more marsh areas outside the city in the green. But you can see that we are very developed in the space between the river and the lake, and that all the water that falls in that basin, in that area, needs to be pumped out. And so when we have events that exceed 2 inches an hour, our pumping system isn't able to keep up with that. And so we see localized flooding events, and which is probably not surprising that you see this disproportionate risk in some areas of the city. So we have our rainfall piece. We also have our heat piece. So you're probably familiar with the term urban heat islands. So again, if you look to that gray paved area of the city, that area is also going to reflect more of the sun's energy and trap that heat near the surface of the ground. And so there's been some metrics that came out recently that rank New Orleans very high in intense heat and heat islands. So not just temperature, but retaining that temperature for longer. So that's held near the ground. And we'll get to how that intersects with what I'm interested in shortly. But another way to look at this is albedo. So how much of the sun's energy is reflected and how much is trapped near the ground. And so this is also impacted by the kind of housing, and we have an older city, older housing stock. We have buildings that are close together and streets that are narrow. So it's trapping more of that than maybe some other city would. We also had a lot of tree canopy decimation, especially post-Katrina. And so that greenery, that tree helps to mitigate that albedo. And so again, we have this disparity in in areas that have been reinvigorated, retreated since Katrina as well. And then so what we see on health is we see this exposure dynamics we're not well understood, but we know that a proportion of the population is at greater risk from impacts of heat. And then even though we get a lot of rain, we also get droughts. And so we have longer periods of drought between weather events. So there are a lot of agencies and entities that are looking to track and understand and look at how these temperatures patterns are changing over time and the areas of the city who are at greatest risk. So there have been some studies by IC Change. It's a citizen science group. This is actually some of their data. They had a truck that drove around the city at dawn and at dusk, and they did a heat map from that information. And so it's a little limited because you could only kind of translate that data out so far, but you can see tracts of land that are much higher. And again, how that correlates to certain parts of the city that we expect this impact to be seen. There's also some programs by the New Orleans Health Department, the BRACE program, strengthening networks, looking at neighborhood level data. And then we also see some heat sensors in certain areas of the city, certain projects that the city is doing around green infrastructure. And so there's a lot more recording of data. So until now, there hasn't been as much data recorded within the city proper. We have National Weather Service information that's at the airport, which is outside the city, or near the lakefront, which is different from the rest of the city. And then we have another gauge that's uptown in Audubon Park. And so those three areas, while we've had extensive long-term data, they're not depicting the city center, the city proper, where the majority of the population lives. So I was lucky enough to work with some organizations in the Hoffman Triangle area of New Orleans. And Hoffman Triangle is a subset of Central City. There's a little wedge here, hence the triangle. This area of the city has one of the lowest life expectancies in Orleans Parish. And of course, as we've been discussing, impacted by social segregation and systemic racism, leading to this lower or depressed life expectancy. We see high rates of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, obesity, diabetes, and mental health. There's also a lack of access and transportation, connecting people to social services, and layering on these environmental impacts as well. So this area in particular is very vulnerable to repeated flooding. It's hard to tell from this map, but this area of Central City declines in elevation. We're not very high above sea level, but we're even lower sort of in that part of the city. So poverty is not unique to this area. About 30% of New Orleanians live in poverty. We have an aging population. 11% of our population is over 65, and about a third of those people live alone and have a high burden of chronic disease. We also know that about 1% of our residents live in homes without any air conditioning, so any access to air conditioning. But then even people who do have maybe a window unit or a room or two that they have access to air conditioning are reluctant to use it. It's very expensive, high energy cost, and so they might use it intermittently or certain parts of the day or delayed delay turning it on. And we also, just to layer out another issue, New Orleans is ninth among 50 cities without piped water. So maybe that there's, unpaid bills or some structural issue that doesn't allow a home to have access to consistent running water. So that's a lot of issues, and that's a lot of issues magnified in this neighborhood. So I teach an undergraduate course called Formation of Public Health Policy. Within this course, and this is a big program at Tulane, is to engage undergraduate students in service learning. And so as part of this policy course, we worked with Dana Ennis. She's the executive director of the Urban Conservancy. And at the time, she had a big project partnership, the Umbrella NOLA partnership. The funding for that has lapsed. It also co-occurred with COVID, which made outreach a little challenging. And a number of these organizations maybe not as active at this point in time, but she was able to bring a number of nonprofits together under this umbrella partnership and focused on the Hoffman Triangle area. They were addressing all of these environmental impacts by looking at green infrastructure, connecting people with projects to improve their homes, to retain water in and around their homes, to alleviate flooding, to plant trees, and then create the network to leverage these programs into a green workforce. So creating training and business opportunities as well. Wonderful program. And now they're moving into other areas of the city. So what is green infrastructure, or what are we trying to do? And sorry, that's cut off a little bit here. But so I'm describing how we have to pump nearly every drop of water that comes that falls into the city. And so that's the top picture here, where we're getting a lot of runoff from homes in the paved areas and parking lots, and we're having flooding in the streets so it makes it difficult for people to walk on sidewalks or to park their cars, or their cars are at risk of flooding. And if we are to move towards a more green infrastructure development, we are removing some of those paved areas, replacing them with green, we have more trees. So we're able to absorb and retain that water, which is good because we're also helping to strengthen our ground and its stability, and reverse kind of the impacts of subsidence. So that again looks like planting trees that are useful for shade and addressing heat island impacts. They beautify neighborhoods. There's a lot about greening neighborhoods and healthy communities. There's also a program to utilize rain barrels to collect water, retain it for a period of time, and then release that or utilize it for gardening. And then removing impermeable paving and putting impermeable paving. So those driveways, those roadways can also absorb the rainfall. So this is a big effort by the umbrella community, engaging with local residents, offering them grants to install these features on their property, at the same time training workforce to learn how to do this and create business opportunities in the future. I'm going to focus, there's so much more I want to say, but I'm going to focus on the rain barrel piece. Green Light New Orleans is an entity that was started after Katrina as a way to reduce consumption. And they originally started with distributing high energy efficient bulbs, and then they moved into water retention and rain barrels. These are great. These are reused food barrels. These are the barrels that come to our city filled with lemons or with olives for our muffaladas, it's crawfish season, so crawfish boil material, and they're cleaned out. They are then primed, so they're sanded, and then they're painted with artwork from volunteers and organizations, and then they're distributed. And there's a sliding scale system, so nearly everyone can find it affordable in the city. There's a big waiting list, but there's already been a big impact. And I didn't update the map here, but you can see as in through 2020, we had quite a lot of rainbows throughout the city. And this is where this starts to intersect with what I'm interested in. So I'm really interested in vector-borne diseases and mosquito mosquitoes. And if we have more people that are retaining water, my concern would be that people are allowing mosquitoes to grow and develop in and around their yards. And so we've talked over time, and they're incorporated into their materials and their design to a way to protect the rain barrel. So that's a closed system. So mosquitoes aren't allowed entry into them. They can't lay eggs in them. They can't develop on the top of them. And they also put out information about how to control mosquitoes if they are an issue. So in this case, using mosquito dunks to stop mosquitoes from growing and developing in that standing water. So they've been a great organization. I've had a lot of undergraduates work with them. They're very welcoming, and we're also looking to partner on other efforts and maybe utilizing those rain barrel sites and that network across neighborhoods to look at things like temperatures and temperature differences as well. So a little bit about mosquitoes while we're on this topic. So mosquitoes are flies, and they're in the order Diptera. They go through 4 life stages. So this is a Culex mosquito, which is a genera of mosquito. They lay their eggs in a raft on the surface of water, about 100 eggs or so. You can see them, they float there. Those hatch out into larvae. Larvae are like growing and developing. If you think about insects, think about like caterpillars, they're eating. In this case, they're in water and they're filter feeding and they're taking in nutrients. So they need to be in water. And then they go through a pupal stage, and then they emerge as an adult. So this is like our cocoon stage, and this is our adult stage. And mosquitoes are relevant because they play a role in transmission of diseases. And they're not just annoying and uncomfortable. We are concerned about how they intersect and transmit diseases. So in the United States, most of the time, we're talking about West Nile virus, and those are spread by that mosquito I just showed you, Culex mosquito. But we have diseases that people are the reservoir host, and we have Aedes mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, that can transmit diseases between people. And those are the big ones. And those are the ones we're concerned about reestablishing, like yellow fever, or establishing in the city for the first time. And so those are things like chikungunya and dengue and Mayaro virus. And so this is kind of the piece that interests me the most. So just another look at pretty mosquito pictures. So this is Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. It has this distinctive shape on the back of the thorax. That's sort of a lyre, or some people call it parenthesis shape. It's a small black and white mosquito, maybe a little brown. It's active at dusk and dawn. It really likes feeding on people. It's pretty aggressive. And this has been a resident of New Orleans since as early as ships came to the city, and has fluctuated over time, but we see it more in the most urban dense parts of the city. Aedes albopictus is also called the Asian tiger mosquito. It's similar in size and coloring. Instead of that pattern on the back, it has a tiger stripe down the back. You can see the stripy legs. It tends to be a little darker. This mosquito came to the United States in waste tires from Southeast Asia in the mid-'80s, and probably arrived in New Orleans around the same time it was discovered in Texas in 1985, but it was definitely confirmed by 87. And so these mosquitoes kind of occupy this urban and suburban or vegetated park areas of the city. And again, both really active at dusk and dawn, but also can be active throughout the day. And then we have our Culex mosquitoes, our Culex fasciatus, our southern house mosquito. You can see it's a bit lighter. Again, that's the one that just lays an egg on the surface, egg raft on the surface of the water. This is our West Nile vector. So these are the 3 main vectors that we think about as our disease vectors. There's a lot of surveillance that is conducted in the city by mosquito control, so the city of New Orleans, in understanding where and when these mosquitoes are active, and also testing them, or at least in the case of Culex fasciatus, testing them for things like West Nile virus, to see if it's present, and to warn people if it is. And so I mentioned we have this kind of interplay with these two species. They both like, so instead of that raft on the surface of the water, they lay their eggs inside containers. And as those containers fill with water, like rainwater, we talked a lot about rain, those eggs will hatch out. If you think about these two mosquitoes globally, Aedes aegypti, again, really likes feeding on people, preferentially feeds on people. Globally, it rests indoors in people's homes. And again, does a little better. Its eggs survive better in the hot, dry conditions of urban areas. So we see higher abundance there. When we think about how they behave in the United States, they're more likely to be outdoor resting. Now, even though there's a proportion of people that don't have air conditioning, we have a more defined, typically indoor and outdoor spaces around our homes. And a lot of people do use air conditioning, and it moves these insects outside. And in the United States, they typically, or in New Orleans in particular, feed more often on other mammals. So your cats and dogs and other things, and not just on people. Both of them have eggs that are very desiccation resistant. They can survive long periods of time inside containers. If you think of a cup, and leaving sort of a cup outside, they can form inside, they lay their eggs inside along the water line of the container. And as that water goes down, they can dry out, they can stay for long periods of time. And when they fill back up with rainwater, that's when you see them hatch out. And they can also hatch out over time. The other species, Aedes albopictus, again, that's the one with the tiger stripe down the back, they also have this adaptation where they can diapause or rest. And so they can overwinter. And so we've seen them spread throughout the United States because they can really tolerate much cooler temperatures and then have a much wider geographic range. While Aegypti, again, most likely found in your urban dense areas and primarily in the southern US at this point. So what do you think? Well, what I think of when I look at mosquito habitats around someone's yard, I'm looking for containers and things that will be filled with rainwater or that people intentionally fill up and keep water in. So a lot of plants and planters and saucers. This is a fountain, a lot of historic fountains in the city. This one isn't circulating, so it potentially could breed mosquitoes. Things out in people's yards and toys. And New Orleans loves coolers. Lots of coolers. They fill up with water lots of different ways, and they are great places for mosquitoes to grow and develop. This person's emptying a bird bath. And think about pet dishes, other things that you intentionally fill up with water on a regular basis. And so a lot of what we do in mosquito control and outreach is saying this, we want you to look for water in your yard. We want you to look at maybe once a week, because it takes about a week, especially when it's warm, for an egg to go from mosquito to adult. And so if you look weekly, then you'll catch where the mosquitoes are growing and developing in those areas. We also talk about tightly closing or having a closed system for cisterns and rain barrows so mosquitoes can't get inside. And so we've done a lot of work, and we, the City of New Orleans, the New Orleans Health Department, have done a lot of work to make sure that the information we give to people looks like our houses, looks like the places that we find mosquitoes in our yards, and gives people places to go to report this information or to have some assistance. So this was kind of during Zika when we had a lot of coordinated efforts, and we were putting out a lot of information through a variety of different ways. The other thing that we really encourage people to do is to utilize personal protection and repellents. And so that might be using netting or treating clothing, but most of the time that is asking people to apply repellents. And people, I try to think about EPA approved repellents or CDC recommended repellents because people have really strong feelings about repellents, and there's a lot of things on the market that aren't very effective. And so this is a list of, we always try to focus on a list of things that are proven to be effective or as effective as DEET. So picaridin, oil lemon eucalyptus, because we know that people oftentimes in the hot, warm summer aren't going to wear long sleeves and pants, but they can take those precautions. So that kind of gets us to, okay, so that's the information we put out. That's how we look for mosquitoes around people's homes. So what puts people at risk for disease transmission? So we know that the interaction between mosquito vectors in humans is really modulated by the social, economic, and their behavioral factors. There's been studies out of Baltimore and DC. So there's Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus. In DC, that's Aedes albopictus. They're more likely to be sampled in medium income neighborhoods. And containers in those neighborhoods are often found in places where people live. So even though there can be a lot of abandonment of houses and yards and properties, where people live tends to be where those containers with mosquitoes growing in them are found. And so we find a lot of containers in other places, but they're not often or consistently filled with water. And so, evidence is really suggesting that communities in the southeastern US are at high risk of infectious disease transmission compared with other communities. We have a warm climate that we discussed, or high humidity, high amounts of rainfall, and we can support abundant vector populations. And then when we look at just the amount of mosquitoes and then also people's behavior and risk. So we talked a little bit about urban poverty and social economics and social vulnerability, and then layering on, will those people, if they are exposed and do get sick, do they have access to healthcare for diagnosis and reporting? So I'm going to go over kind of a series of studies to look at those kind of different parts of that big picture about transmission dynamics. These were from quite a few years ago, going through the neighborhoods, going into certain neighborhoods and looking for containers in people's yards. And part of that was to understand what's the most important containers, what's the most contributing containers. And we found a lot of flower pots and bird baths. So again, unmanaged containers to some, well, flower pots can be managed if you water a lot, but things like pet dishes and fountains and bird baths are all, and rain barrels are there, but also things and items just left in people's yard. So even in November and December of that year, we did find a lot of containers that had larvae in them, so that they were active and they were at pretty high levels, and levels that we consider high enough to support transmission if a disease were to be introduced. And a abundant amount of those containers, we found Aedes aegypti, and we also found a little bit of the other species I discussed, and that probably had to do with the time of year that we were looking. And then we also talked to people that lived in those homes while we did the survey around their yards, and we found, certain characteristics like renting, gardening, and rainfall had a lot to do with whether we'd find positive containers or not. So that's immature mosquitoes and how we did a study to kind of look at where within the yard or what kind of items would be most abundant and what people knew about arthropod-borne disease. And then so our next step was to look at adult mosquitoes. So there's a lot of science behind trapping and history around trapping adult mosquitoes. One way we can trap adult mosquitoes is just to aspirate them. So this is just a big vegetation aspiration. We're going through, sometimes you call it a Nash aspirator, vegetation aspirator. You're just collecting whatever's resting in the vegetation. So you're going to get mosquitoes, you're going to get lots of other non-target insects, and you also have a higher likelihood of catching insects that have already fed, and so they're resting, and so sometimes that's useful as well. And then we are also looking for mosquitoes to fly to a trap. And so this is a CDC miniature light trap. It's hard to see there, but it can have a light bulb in the middle. There's a fan in the middle there. And so you hang this, usually you utilize dry ice that will sublimate and release CO2, so mimicking a host. And so you get host-seeking mosquitoes that come into this looking for a blood meal. They get attracted by that CO2, they come towards the light, they fly through the fan, and they end up in this collection container. And then there was a new tool, relatively new tool, called the BG Sentinel trap. This is model 2. It targets collection specifically of Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. You can use it with dry ice or CO2, but you also have this lure, and the lure really smells like human sweat or skin, and that really lures mosquitoes into this trap. And so we did some trapping in neighborhoods by SVI, and we really found that Aedes albopictus co-occurred in areas with high vulnerability and when average temperature was the highest. Egypti, we didn't see this association. We didn't see an association with SVI or with any other meteorological variables or with any abandonment. So we're seeing kind of what they're seeing in Baltimore, but we're not seeing it for both species. And it looks like I'm already running a little bit long, so I just want to go a little bit through some of our work with canine heartworm disease, and those are some of the students that worked on the project. Sorry, gratuitous canine heartworm, I should have warned you. But canine heartworm is Diriflaria imminis. It's a parasitic roundworm in dogs. It causes heartworm disease. Mosquito spread this parasite. The infectious stage, the microflare, is acquired through a blood meal from an infected dog host, and then spread to, after going through a development cycle, spread to other dogs as well. In dogs, their symptoms are cough, tiredness, and decreased appetite and weight loss, but it eventually will always lead to heart failure. So this parasite can infect cats, can infect humans, but we don't see the worm developing to maturity and seeing the impact on the heart. So in the southern United States, the incidence is very high. This is 2022 data, and you can see for the southern U.S., Louisiana is in the highest range, and in New Orleans, the highest of the high. So Louisiana is second in heartworm prevalence. New Orleans reports more than 100 cases per clinic. And we have year-round transmission. We have an effective tool. We have preventative treatments that stop the infection with the heartworm and stop it from replicating in the canine host. They are not terribly expensive. They range from $5 to $15 a month. You can apply some to the skin. There are chewable options, but this often requires someone having to go bring their animal to a vet to receive this. So even if it's not terribly expensive, although that still can be a high amount for a household, it still requires a veterinary visit. So I'm just going to say that we have found heartworm or heartworm-like parasites in Albopictus in the mid-90s. And in Florida, we found Albopictus in Egypti that were infected. And most recently in Texas, they also found that Egypti could be contributing to a canine heartworm transmission, and that they did also feed on dogs there. And even the mosquitoes that fed on humans were also positive for heartworm. Not saying that humans were infected with heartworm, but saying that they are feeding both on humans and dogs and have been previously infected. So we did some testing of freezer mosquitoes. So we tested a lot of mosquitoes to see, okay, which one is maybe the primary vector in New Orleans. We used PCR method to look at a COI region of the parasite. This is abbreviations for Culex, those three mosquitoes I talked about. So the Culex quincunfuscatus, Aedes albopictus, and Aedes aegypti. And we did see that Culex quinx and Aedes albopictus were positive, albeit at low rates, but that was enough to kind of get us interested. And so we wanted to know what the primary vector species was in the city. And then we really wanted to look at neighborhood differences and kind of correlate that with the amount of mosquitoes we're seeing and see if there is year-round transmission, do we see it in the mosquitoes as well? And then from this, what we really wanted to do is use this as a way to talk to people about mosquito-borne diseases. So this past fall, it was a very hot, very dry summer. So we really didn't start trapping until the fall. In fact, there were almost no mosquitoes, strangely, until the fall. So we used that dry ice baited light trap. We used those aspirators to go into people's backyards, into certain areas, in certain neighborhoods of the city. Again, we're looking at socially vulnerable differences across the city. We also went to places where people bring their dogs. So dog parks and sniff spots. There's this fountain in front of the zoo that a lot of people go to. And we started in late September and we collected until November. And again, very hot, very dry. So we collected about 3,000 mosquitoes. Unfortunately, not any really albopictus. Again, hot dry year, but we did find some Culex and we did find some Aedes aegypti. And then we also found these other species that are more common in the fall and after kind of a larger, later rain event. We pooled the mosquitoes together and we tested the pooled mosquitoes. Some of those pools were small and some were large, so 2 to 24 mosquitoes. And then we found 2 pools of Egypti that tested positive for heartworm, 4 and 5 mosquitoes each, and then 1 pool of Culex faciatus with 2 mosquitoes. But because of the low number of mosquitoes tested, that really put our infection rate very high, so higher than what we had seen before. All of our positives were at residential locations, so none of those dog parks and other places that people bring their animals, but in people's backyards, in their neighborhoods. We also, of those mosquitoes we collected, 24 were blooded or partially blooded. So we used, again, primers to look at the COI region of that blood meal, and then we sequenced that information to see if we can match it back to a source. We found Egypti and the Egypti was always feeding on people, and we found Culex that were feeding on a wide variety of animals like possums and ibis and egrets. And we had some difficulty matching all of the data. And so that's just a map of those places we collected in the blooded mosquitoes. So we really found widespread heartworm presence across species of New Orleans. It's concerning, but we didn't get enough positives in enough locations to look at any differences between them. We weren't able to really determine which one is the primary vector. We know they're all can be important at different times, and maybe there's some seasonality to this. There's this great organization in town, the Interpup, and they really meet people where they are. They go out and they do neighborhood events where instead of having to bring your dog to a vet, you can come in, you can be seen by a vet, and you can receive heartworm prevention. And I'm looking to partner with them to kind of get the word out about what we're seeing in our mosquito studies and getting people that have dogs interested in mosquito prevention in their yards. And so working on fact sheets and partnering with them, maybe take home items, maybe getting them, hey, can we come home with you and take a look in your yard and see where those mosquitoes might be. And gratuitous picture of my dog. This is Gizmo. Oops. This is our vet. It's his Instagram link there if you're interested in following him. I'm not saying you have to, but you can. And so really finding effective measures of community engagement is important in removing breeding habitats in people's backyards and houses. And sharing some of this information with our dog owning community, making sure that they understand that mosquitoes are an important part of heartworm transmission, and then also saying, zeroing in on one of those mosquitoes and which one would be the most important. Other thing I found really interesting is that nearly half of us have dogs, and about half of us spend more on our own pets. Maybe this is not surprising to people, but than their own health. So this could be kind of a way to really engage people. People are really used to things like West Nile. They don't necessarily change their behaviors when you talk about disease occurring, but if you could also get them to do this to help their animals as well, that might be a way to get more people to engage. And then making sure the information that on heartworm education is accurate and includes the vector-borne piece as well. If you had a minute, this is a link to a survey about what's the kind of messaging that we should send to people. How do we say this? What are the wording that we can use, do you think, that would be effective? So if you want to scan that and complete that or follow that link, that would be great. And then otherwise, I just want to thank all the students that have been working on this project over time. This is Angela. She received a Louisiana Mosquito Control Association Research Fund Award to start this work, turn her dog there. We also had the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching that awarded undergraduate grants to work on it. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Don Wesson, Berlin Londano, and Sam Jameson, who shared their lab space and materials with these students. And this is Heather, Gabe, and Madison that worked on the collections last fall. So that's a little bit more, and that's all I have. So are there any questions? Do I have time for questions?
Yeah, you do. So I was going to say, thank you so much, Dr. Michaels, for that presentation. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A chat, and I will read them out loud for Dr. Michaels to answer. And so we do have one question already in the Q&A chat. The question is the research surrounding the KAP surveys published? If so, where would I be able to find it?
Good question. It is in my dissertation, but it is not published as a separate publication at this point. Good point. I should revisit that. My dissertation is published through Tulane, and you would be able to find it there.
Do you have a link by chance, Dr. Michaels?
Ooh,
If not,
Mm,
that's totally fine. We can always,
I think it's linked on my NCBI page. But I can also, yeah, share it.
all right, we got another question in the Q&A. She said, thank you.
Thank you. It's a little strange not to see an audience, I have to say. It's a little bit different style of presenting, but good to know that you're out there. And I don't know if my information shared. I'm also happy to answer any.
Yeah. So, the question from Trinity is, how can NPH students get involved in your work?
I mean, there is a part of my work that would be local and on ground here. Certainly students either in my department or outside of my department are welcome. Oops, my internet connection is a little unstable apparently. But yeah, just send me an email. We'll set up a time to chat. We're working on some other grants around ticks in the state and tick-borne diseases. So interested in leveraging what we have and applying for more. And we also have data as well to analyze. So if field work isn't your thing or lab work, there are other options as well.
I also dropped in the chat Dr. Michael's email address as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I have another question. Can you put the QR code up again?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if you can see me or not. I hid my meeting controls and now I can't see anything. There are two steps to that. The first step is you kind of pick one of those, and then the other step is you can add some additional ideas.
And Trinity said thank you for answering her question.
No worries.
Have another question. Has there been data to show increase in goo with certain areas of New Orleans related to the maps you have shown?
Oh, dengue. So we have not had any local cases of dengue in New Orleans that we know of. There has been an increased number of returning travelers with dengue. It's a really good question, and I really wanted to get into the lot more. It's hard to fit everything in this. So the trend is that we have more and more people returning to the United States infected with dengue, and then we're starting to see pockets of local transmission in Texas and in Florida, and we have not yet seen that here. But the information that we have is that we do seem to have enough mosquitoes and potentially enough exposure that we could have local transmission here given the right conditions, but we have not seen that yet. And Michael, have you or colleagues done any work on fungal and entopathogens? Ooh, mosquito compared to other regions. Fungal, no, we are looking at bacterial pathogens. So Wolbachia is probably the most common, and you may have heard of Wolbachia before. We're looking, interesting, canine heartworm is always infected with Wolbachia, and Aedes aegypti is not supposed to be infected with Wolbachia. And so we're screening populations and we're looking at that. So I guess once we move from the bacteria, fungal pathogen sounds really interesting, but we haven't looked at that yet.
Michael said, thank you. Any more questions? All right, if there's not any more questions, again, thank you all so much for joining the Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Michaels, for presenting. No more questions. You all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.